Diana had reached out to me, and she's always been supportive and engaging in a strong way with me. So she happens to have some experience and some interesting insight on how one can look at astrology. So there are a lot of interesting studies separate from markets as it relates to astrology, where we are in terms of solar cycles and human behavior. So keep an open mind. We'll have an interesting back and forth here. This is not an area I know too much about, so I'm kind of curious myself. With all that said, my name is Michael Guyot, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me here, Diana Evans, who has the Phoenix on her profile here. Diana, introduce yourself to the audience and to me as far as your background, what you've done throughout your life, throughout your career, and how you got interested in markets.
Hey, Michael. Hey, everyone. How are you guys doing today? So a little bit about myself. I've been selling real estate and done property management. I flip houses. So not really so much in the market, but have been interested. I mean, my father worked at the Federal Reserve when I was growing up. So I've always been interested in money and money creation and quantitative easing, quantitative tightening and whatnot, and just how it ran. So for me, when 2020 hit and all this stuff started to happen. Oh, I also have a minor in economics from college, and my major was international business. So, I mean, I've always been interested in business and whatnot. But when 2020 hit and the Fed started going on a spending orgy, it was like nothing made sense to me. Like the whole world had went, if you want to say lunacy. Like it just nothing made sense. So like I started to look and I'm like, what is going on? Because this just doesn't make sense. We're just printing tons of money all over the world. And so that kind of took me down this rabbit hole of looking at the solar and the lunar cycles. And then all of a sudden things started to make a lot of logical sense to me. I'm not saying that it has to make sense to anyone else, but it made sense to me. And that's where I kind of got into this, like they're blowing up. The system's like, the Fed is in a spot where like they can't do anything. So where are we going with this, and what is happening? And along the way, I came across people that have studied this stuff in the past. And I mean, the information is out on the web. That's the thing today, is there's a lot of information out there, but we're kind of drowning in information and starving for wisdom, I always say. So that's what got me to this point. And like the solar cycle, like the solar cycle 24 was the lowest we'd had on record in modern history. And now we were going into a very extensive, like the solar cycle risen faster than it ever has in history.
But let's explain first of all what a solar cycle is. A lot of people, I think, they hear these things, they think it's sounds a little fantastical or strange as to how it relates to anything, right? But explain what a solar cycle is.
Well, so the sun, it gives us life. I mean, without the sun, we're not on this planet. So a solar cycle is 11 years between 7 and 14 years. It goes from minimum to maximum. So an 11-year cycle. And then you have a lunar cycle, which is like 18.6 years. And that's a metonic cycle. And when you're talking about, like, when you're saying that about like lunacy and lunatic, our bodies are conditioned to the sun and the moon. The moon is 28.5 days. The 24-hour cycle is the sun going up and down our circadian rhythms. So our bodies like are adjusted to the moon and the sun too. So there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to it. I mean, into like the physiological and physio aspects. But when it relates to markets, like I started studying, and then I looked back and I was looking at like inflation and different things. And I was like, wait a second, why is this all tracking? Like it's all tracking. But again, is it right? I don't know. I mean, I'm not in Powell's head or into anybody. I don't know what they're doing at that level. But for me, it just started to make some logical sense as to what's going on, because the rest of it's not making sense to me.
Oh, okay. So as I'm looking at it as we're chatting, so solar cycle is basically about sunspots, right? Cycles when it comes to sunspots in the sun.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
So at solar minimum, there's few sunspots, and then at solar maximum, as you go up to solar maximum, there's more solar spots. And it does affect human behavior.
Okay. So I think that's where, if we can expand on that, I think that's where it gets to be kind of intriguing. So what is the link between the sunspot, that dynamic, and then how that historically impacts the way people think, feel, or any kind of historical other events that you've seen?
Well, it gets really esoteric. Our hearts are batteries, our minds are batteries. And so we are powered. I think somehow the sun like powers us. I know that sounds really weird to a lot of people, and like the moon too. So that's where they get when the full moon, people there's more homicides, there's more suicides, there's more different things like that when the full moon is out. So somehow it affects our physiology in some way. And again, like this is not like you said, it's not common knowledge. I don't know if it's not been told to us or why we don't know this information, but it's more talking about like electromagnetism and magnetic behavior. So yeah. And then there's a thing that covers the earth, which is like the ionosphere, and that's weakening and whatnot. So along with that, I mean, I do think there's a lot, like, to me, again, in 2020, it seemed to me like systems are being blown up in the United States of America. I don't know where people are throughout the world, but at least in the United States of America, like systems are being blown up. Like our healthcare system is going to take a big hit because of COVID. Our educational system is going to take a big hit because of COVID. I think monetary, like I do think I sent you that link for the pets crash window. We're still in it. And I do think I completely 100% agree with you. If the central banks are kind of, I don't know where they go from here. So if Japan happens to fall, then it's going to be a global margin call and people just aren't paying attention. Like that's the thing. I just don't think people are paying attention at all. Like when we look at, again, I'm in real estate here in the States, and I mean, this is not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. I mean, we're at a point where, like, I mean, that's the thing. Like I ask people, like when I'm out talking to people, it's like, why did interest rates go from 2% to 8%? Like, give me a logical reason for that. And then they'll say the stuff that's parroted to them, but I don't see a logical reason.
So there's, again, because I find this to be just interesting to explore. So for those that are in the audience, I have my own papers on ssrn.com, Social Science Research Network, but that's a repository of all kinds of different research papers on different topics. And there is a paper that was published in 2021, Sunspots and Animal Spirits, the Origin of Keynes's Cycle Theory. So I'm going to read just the initial part of the abstract, but I think this provides some interesting context around some of the things that Diana is saying. So that paper, Sunspots and Animal Spirits, the Origins of Keynes's Cycle Theory, goes like this. And this is actually based on what Diana put, which I shared in the nest around Stanley Jevons' sunspot theory. So again, this is all new to me too, but sounds intriguing. William Stanley Jevons, in quotes, sunspot theory of business cycles related the number of spots in the sun to economic activity, primarily through the weather and agriculture side of things, but also through psychological components like optimism and uncertainty. So now it makes a little bit more sense, right? To the extent that what's going on with the sun impacts weather, agriculture, that has all kinds of implications on business cycles, especially historically when we were a more agrarian society. The abstract that continues to go on and says the theory is widely discredited, but John Maynard Keynes agreed with Jevons' underlying use of market participants' moods to explain the transmission and magnification of the boom and bust phases of the cycle. So to the extent that, whether you believe in it or not, that where the moon is or the eclipse or solar sunspots, whatever it be, to the extent that it does impact human behavior, there are implications on market dynamics. There's also other interesting studies around, for example, and maybe Diana, you can talk this too, around seasonal affective disorder, which is often used as actually one of the reasons for why you have the sell in May, go away dynamic. And that does relate to mood also.
We've been taught, at least that the sun is not good for us, whereas in essence, it is very good for us to be in the sunlight, to sun gaze in the morning and at night, and to get sun on your skin. So like the whole idea, like again, too, I think what some of us are learning is that the ancients had different ideas about living than we do modern times. And like I've noticed too, like Michael, like you're talking about fasting, right? Like that's a huge thing. Like our bodies are machines. So like that's where I'm going back to, like being powered. So like, yes, our moods are powered by the sun. That's why seasonal affective disorder. And then there's another guy who back in the times of Stalin, Alexander Chizhevsky, and he talked a lot about, again, this kind of stuff. And then there's a really interesting theory that he has about pandemics, which, like I've told people, they can go research for themselves and determine what they think of it. But that a lot of pandemics happen at solar minimum and solar maximum. And I went back and it seems to be pretty clear. I mean, again, too, assuming that the solar minimum and solar maximums are what we're being told, then yeah, it's true. So, I mean, you go back and you look at almost every pandemic and it happened at solar minimum or solar maximum. But again, too, like I said, with the Fed too, I mean, like that's the thing too. I guess when I ask people, I mean, that's the thing, like I have so many questions, like, and this was back when I was 13 with my dad working at the Fed. How is money created? And if you ask the normal person on the street, people don't have any clue how money is created. And I think the Fed's kind of, I mean, there was an interview on the 60 Minutes where they basically say they printed out of thin air, which is exactly what they do. They print it out of thin air and then they pass it around. So, I mean, again, we went off the gold standard in 1971 and have been in a fiat money system since then. When we look around, inflation right now is like astounding. The income and inequality gap is astounding. There's just a lot going on that I think we're coming in for a lot of big changes, not just in monetary, but all around. And I think people are not paying attention. Like that's what I find it so funny, especially on your tweets, because they'll be like this or that. And the reality is it's coming down.
Well, I mean, the reality is that everyone screams about being bullish or bearish, me included, and stocks haven't done anything for 2 years. Right? I mean, we're all arguing for things to go up or down. We're all in the same place, actually worse after inflation, which is interesting, I think. There is a quote that you shared in that post, which I've seen before, that's attributed to JP Morgan. Millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. Again, I know it sounds fantastical and strange to maybe some people in the audience, but if it is ultimately about long cycles, you often hear Neil Howe's work around the fourth turning being referenced. Is there anything around cycles like what Neil Howe focuses on around fourth turning and society and all that stuff, and where we are in terms of astrology?
Well, 100%, I think there is. I mean, again, that when we look at like the fourth turning, when we look at cycles, the obvious question to ask is what causes the cycle? I mean, like, what is behind that cycle? Because it seems like it's fairly consistent throughout history, right? So, like, I mean, again, too, like when 2020 hits and we have a pandemic, and the last big pandemic was 1918, which is almost exactly 100 years ago. It's like, wait a second, what is the cycle that's turning this? So that's what I'm saying. Yes, I do think there's a huge thing to cycles. And yes, I do think we're in the fourth turning. Again, I wish I would have been paying attention prior to 2020 because I wasn't. I hadn't even read the book. So again, it's what causes a cycle, because there has to be something that causes a cycle. It's not just willy-nilly. I mean, I think everything here is kind of a loop. It's a cycle, and we go through that consistently, and we just happen to be in this cycle right now. And I mean, when I say you look at inflation, if you look at solar cycle 24, which went from 2008 to 2020, and you look at interest rates, they were very low. And then we hit 2020, and then they started going up. And like I said, they went up in not astronomical fashion. The change from real estate in 2020, 2021 to 2023 is ridiculous. I mean, the markets are freezing up. So in 2008, everyone was taken by surprise because they said houses only go up in value, they never go down. And then 2008 happened and they went down. And all of a sudden, everyone's forgotten that 14 years later, people have forgotten that the houses go up and then they go down. So you've got people, I mean, when in 2021, people were bidding $50,000, $60,000 over list price and at 2% interest rates. And now I do think we're going to see a huge correction in the housing market as well.
So let's talk about this, given that you talk about, you yourself flip houses. I don't know where you're located, but, has it been sort of more and more challenging? Has there been more of an abrupt stop? Talk about just some of the things that you've done personally.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, too, the past 2020, 2021, 2022 were good. It's kind of frozen at the moment right now. I mean, people are still buying, but yeah, it's definitely, but people are still buying houses. But I mean, I don't understand if you're buying houses at that price, at that interest rate, we're in a completely unsustainable market for a lot of people, let's say. The prices of the homes just keep going up and up. I mean, we've got runaway inflation. We've got it's just kids are coming out of college with $250,000 in debt. We're in a debt-based society. That's really what it is what we're looking at. And I think this is an interesting question too. And maybe you want to answer this one for me, Michael. When in the stock market, right? When stocks go up, people make money. When stocks go down, people lose money. But where does that money go? Like, where is that money? And that's where I think people really have to question the whole fiat money system and say, what are we doing here? And you're much more familiar with this because you're tweeting a lot more about the market, but people just don't seem to believe you. I mean, the people that are following you, they believe you.
Well, in fairness, I don't mind if people don't believe me because that probably means I'm right. It's like, I always go back to the crowd is right on average, but wrong at the extreme. And for whatever it's worth, look, obviously I've been wrong with the circuit breaker idea this week. I mean, so far, but this week's not over. I keep going back to like, you just don't know. Anything can happen. And my whole thesis was really around just Japan, which I do think is an imminent risk. But I do think that for whatever it's worth, this week is a good example of why I keep saying never short and don't buy puts. Why in my own research papers, I explicitly make it clear that the best expression of risk off is historically long duration treasuries and utilities, because at least if you're wrong in a direction, you can still have a chance at making money and even still be way right being in those areas of the marketplace, which are actually outperforming, right? Quite
Mhm.
nicely the last couple of days. So, which is funny because it's like, it was the fact that ideally you want to, when you think about markets, you want to ideally be wrong and still have a chance, right? Which
Yeah.
you don't have a chance with puts, you don't have a chance with shorting. Now, to that end, okay, so, and it's funny because as we're chatting, I'm trying to quickly kind of self educate myself on the astrology stuff. There aren't that many books. I see a few of them, but there aren't that many books that kind of really get into astrology, planet movement, moon movement, all eclipses, all the stuff, and markets. There's a few, but not
Mhm.
like a very well covered space. For those that actually want to learn more and are just kind of curious, right? If anything, it's just something interesting. Talk about just kind of what you mentioned the internet, but how do you even go about trying to find things which are somewhat not concentrated in one tome?
All you have to do is just Google it. I mean, again, too, and again, that's where I'm saying you have to use your intuition and you have to use your discernment. Like I said, I think that the sun and the moon, it affects markets. I think it affects a lot of things here on this planet. And as you dive into it, it's interesting and it's fun to see because it gives you a totally different outlook on it. But also too, yeah, I mean, like what you're saying, Michael Burry back in '08, people I think thought he was crazy and he turned out to be right. So yeah, I do think you're on the right path. And I think we're going to see, like you said, the week is not over. And I think when we were talking about the Pets crash window, that's open until the end of the week. And that was an interesting one. And like, that's the thing too, is like, I dived into this. I haven't completely dove into it where I could write a paper on it, but like I was trying to calculate some things last night when it goes by lunar months, because lunar months are different than actual months. And if you look at the 1929 and the 1987 crash, when it's the solar eclipse and then the lunar eclipse and then the full moon and then the dates. So this Pets window is open until the 5th. So, and I think it could go to the next full moon in November too. I think that would still fall within the window. And like, that's the interesting thing. Like when we say that is because like I put in Pets crash window on Twitter. There's nobody. I mean, there's a couple of people tweeting about it, but really not very many people are tweeting about it. So I don't think people look at astrology. Laymen don't look at astrology at all. And like you said, I think most people would say this is absolute like insane to even be discussing this, but there is something to it. That I'm sure.
Yeah, and to be clear, I shared it because I thought it was interesting, and then I think you had messaged me, or you had messaged me first, then I looked into it, and then shared it. And I said very clearly, like it's not something that goes into my own analysis. I think it's important for people to always recognize that just because it's raining doesn't mean you'll crash. Just because it's sunny doesn't mean you won't. But usually, most major tail events, right? Most major crashes do have certain markers. So maybe that window is a marker that typically happens prior to a crash, just like. And I can prove it from my own studies. Lumbered gold tends to be a warning in advance. Utilities tends to be a warning in advance. The moving average tends to be a warning in advance. Treasuries themselves tend to be a warning in advance. Just because they're warning doesn't mean you're guaranteed to have something happen. It's just that if you have something happen, they tend to already be a warning. And that I think is a hard concept for a lot of people to really get their minds around.
Yeah, cause is not correlation, but correlate. Yeah, exactly. And I think there was some talk about the Pets crash window last year. And I wasn't as deep into it as I was now. But also, too, I mean, you got to remember, too, like, I mean, it's history. I mean, we're in a modern day and age, but also, too, if you look back to like more ancient calendars were different. There was different ways to measure time. So it's very interesting. I mean, because back like the 28-day calendar versus the 30-day calendar and 31-day calendar, like 28 days for the lunar cycle, and then there was a day out of time, like that kind of stuff. It's very interesting. I mean, obviously back then they didn't have the markets the way that we do today, but a lot of that stuff is just interesting. Again, if you're interested in it, I just find it fascinating because it explains something very illogical to me and made it logical. And I try to be a very logical thinker. So a lot of that stuff came together and made sense to me.
But I mean, other than this specific window, right?
Mhm.
These are very long cycle dynamics, right? Just because of the way the nature of planetary movement and cycles when it comes to the moon. So talk about how you actually implement that for your portfolio. Again, recognizing that primarily it's been more on the housing, real estate side, but with this in the background, how does it inform your decision for what to do, with stocks or bonds or commodities?
I don't have a ton of money in the stock market. Mine's more in real estate. I'm more in the flipping part because I think people are insane to buy a house right now, to be quite honest. So I that is my market, but I think people are nuts to be buying real estate right now.
So going back to where we are in terms of the Sunspot cycles. So
Mhm.
for next year, what would history suggest about what happens next year and maybe the year after?
Well, history suggests we're going into a recession, which doesn't make any sense because I think we're already in a recession. So you go from minimum to maximum, and then at maximum, prior to hitting maximum, the sun's magnetic fields flip. And that is happening probably as we speak or sooner. So once that flips, then you start going into the minimum, unless you have a double peak. And like, that's what I'm saying too. Like Chisovetsky, he would talk about the sun. And when you were at maximums, there was like revolutions and there was wars. And so if anyone's heard this saying, as above, so below. So what happens up here affects us down here. So I think we're in for a very rocky next till the end of the year. Like, I think it's going to be crazy down here. But again, too, people have to remember today in today's society, we have so much information at our fingertips. I think too much that anything can be put onto a screen and be told that it's valid. So you really just have to use your discernment and your intuition and check out once in a while and not live life and not worry about all the stuff that's going on, because I think at the end of the day, it's all going to be fine, in my opinion.
I joke, but not joke, that if there were ever a year I could just not be connected to the internet and not be in the US, it would be next year. I think a lot of people probably share that view. I think it's going to be personally a shit show, for lack of a way of saying it. Dan, I know you're using X and obviously interested in markets, and I think this whole focus is interesting. But for those that want to track more of your thoughts and then maybe want to just kind of explore more how astrology might impact markets, and again, it's all ultimately about cycles and mood and human behavior. How do people find you, reach out to you, or maybe get more of your thoughts? Because I think your journey is somebody who's not necessarily watching or doing markets on a day-to-day basis, right? There's a lot of people like that, but that have an interest in some of these dynamics.
Yeah, well, my DMs are always open. I'm spending less. I like Twitter, but I kind of burnt out on it here for a little bit. But if anyone wants a direction or anything, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to send you information that I've researched, that I've looked at. And I always love conversations with people. And the cool thing is I've met a lot of really cool people on X, and I'm very fortunate for those conversations that I've had on the app.
I'm glad at least some people have a sense of humor. I mean, it's more on the side that I'm amazed at how people don't quite understand sarcasm for a lot of the things, but I guess that's to be expected. Anyway, so listen, everybody, please make sure you follow Diana here on X. And keep it in mind, take a look. I mean, I'm going to do some research myself on it. I think it's just intriguing. And I do think there is some validity to looking to the stars. I have another space coming up. Hopefully, I'll see you all at the top of the hour. Thank you, Diana.
Thanks so much, Michael.